Marcus Chen pressed his face against the reinforced viewport of Research Station Kepler-7, watching the worst storm in the planet's recorded history tear across the frozen landscape. Ice crystals the size of dinner plates hammered against the transparent aluminum, each impact sending vibrations through the station's hull. The wind howled like a living thing, reaching velocities that would have stripped paint from a starship. "Another beautiful day in paradise," Marcus muttered, checking the atmospheric readings on his tablet. The temperature outside had dropped to minus 60 degrees Celsius, with wind gusts exceeding 200 kilometers per hour. Even the station's advanced heating systems were struggling to maintain comfortable temperatures in the outer sections. As the chief maintenance technician for the remote research station, Marcus had seen plenty of brutal weather during his 3 years on Glacialis Prime. The planet was a frozen hellscape under normal circumstances, but during storm season, it became something far worse. Most of the research staff had evacuated to the underground bunkers, leaving only essential personnel like Marcus to keep the station running. His tablet chimed with an alert. Power fluctuation in the eastern sensor array. Marcus sighed and grabbed his emergency repair kit from the supply locker. The sensor array was critical for monitoring the planet's unique geological activity, and the research team would have his head if it went offline during the storm. Marcus suited up in his heavy-duty environmental gear, triple-checking the heating elements and life support systems. One mistake out there, and he would be frozen solid before anyone could mount a rescue. The airlock cycled through its sequence, and he stepped out into the screaming chaos of the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, even through his insulated suit. Ice immediately began forming on his visor, and he had to activate the thermal desing system. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked him off his feet, and he had to use the guide cables strung between buildings to make any progress. The sensor array building was only 50 meters from the main station, but it felt like kilometers in the howling wind. Marcus fought his way along the guide cable, his boots struggling to find purchase on the ice-covered walkway. Visibility was near zero, and he relied entirely on the cable and his suit's navigation system to stay on course. 20 meters from the sensor building, Marcus heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. Over the roar of the wind, he could swear he heard crying. Not human crying, but something else. Something small and desperate. Marcus activated his suit's audio amplifiers and listened carefully. There it was again, a high-pitched, keening sound that cut through the storm's fury. It was coming from somewhere off to his left, away from the safety of the guide cables. Every instinct told Marcus to ignore the sound and complete his mission. The sensor array needed repairs, and venturing off the marked path in this storm was suicide. But the crying continued, and there was something heartbreaking about it that he couldn't ignore. Marcus checked his suit's power levels and thermal reserves. He had enough for a brief detour, but not much more. Against his better judgment, he activated his emergency beacon so the station would know his location, then carefully left the guide cable and headed toward the sound. The terrain was treacherous, covered in jagged ice formations that the wind had carved into knife-sharp sculptures. Marcus used his emergency ice axe to steady himself as he climbed over a small ridge, following the distress calls that seemed to be getting closer. He found them huddled in a shallow depression behind a wind-carved ice wall. Two small creatures, no larger than house cats, pressed together for warmth. At first glance, Marcus thought they might be some kind of Arctic fox kit, but as he got closer, he realized they were something far more extraordinary. The creatures had scales instead of fur, pale white scales that seemed almost translucent in the light from his helmet lamps. They had elongated necks, delicate wings folded against their sides, and small horns protruding from their skulls. Dragons. Baby dragons, barely larger than kittens. Marcus had heard the rumors, of course. Some of the research teams had reported sightings of large flying creatures in the planet's upper atmosphere, but no one had ever gotten close enough for confirmation. The creatures were thought to be a myth, a case of observer error or wishful thinking, But here they were, two baby dragons freezing to death in the storm. Their scales were blue-white from the cold, and frost had formed around their tiny nostrils. They were barely breathing, their small bodies shivering violently as they tried to preserve what little body heat remained. Marcus didn't hesitate. He opened his emergency supply pack and pulled out the thermal blankets, wrapping the two small creatures carefully. They were so cold their scales felt like ice against his gloves. He activated several chemical heat packs and placed them around the dragons, then carefully lifted both creatures and tucked them inside his jacket against his chest. The dragons stirred weakly at the warmth, making small chirping sounds that tugged at Marcus's heart. One of them opened pale blue eyes and looked up at him with an expression of such trust and gratitude that Marcus felt his throat tighten. "Don't worry, little ones," Marcus whispered. "I've got you." Getting back to the station was a nightmare. The storm had intensified, and carrying the dragons made navigating the ice formations twice as difficult. Marcus had to climb one-handed in several places, using his axe while keeping his other arm protectively around the small creatures tucked inside his jacket. The dragons remained still during the journey, as if they sensed that movement might make things more difficult for their rescuer. Occasionally, Marcus felt tiny claws grip his shirt as they tried to hold on, and the small sounds they made told him they were still alive. By the time Marcus reached the guide cable, his suit's power reserves were running dangerously low. The heating elements were drawing more power than usual to combat the extreme cold, and the storm seemed to be getting worse by the minute. He clipped his safety harness to the cable and let it guide him back to the station, fighting against exhaustion and the weight of his precious cargo. The airlock had never looked so welcoming. Marcus stumbled inside and waited for the decontamination cycle to complete, all while speaking softly to the dragons inside his jacket. Almost there. Just a little longer. Once inside, Marcus headed straight for the medical bay. He needed to assess the dragons' condition and get them properly warmed up. The medical bay was equipped with everything necessary to treat hypothermia and frostbite, and Marcus hoped it would be enough. He carefully removed the dragons from his jacket and placed them on the examination table. Under the bright medical lights, he could see them more clearly. They were definitely dragons, with perfect miniature features that matched every fantasy book description he had ever read. Their scales were a pristine white, almost albino, and their wings were delicate membranes stretched over fine bone structures. Marcus ran the medical scanners over both creatures, trying to adapt the human settings for their unique physiology. Their body temperature was dangerously low, and their respiratory rate was shallow. Severe hypothermia, but they were still alive. He prepared warming pads and set them to a low temperature, not wanting to shock their systems. He also prepared a glucose solution, thinking they might need the energy to help their bodies recover. The hard part was figuring out dosages for creatures that didn't exist in any medical database. As the warming pads began to take effect, the dragons started to show more signs of life. Their breathing became stronger, and their scales began to lose the blue tint of extreme cold. The larger of the two dragons opened its eyes and looked directly at Marcus, making a small trilling sound that seemed almost like a question. "You're going to be okay," Marcus said softly. "Both of you." The smaller dragon stirred and tried to lift its head. Marcus could see that it was weaker than its companion, possibly younger. He adjusted the warming pad temperature slightly and added another heat pack to help raise its body temperature. Hours passed as Marcus monitored the dragon's recovery. He had completely forgotten about the sensor array repair that had brought him out into the storm in the first place. All that mattered was making sure these incredible creatures survived. As dawn approached and the storm began to weaken, both dragons were showing remarkable improvement. They were moving more freely, making soft, chirping sounds to each other, and their scales had returned to their natural, pristine white color. They seemed curious about their surroundings, their large blue eyes taking in everything with obvious intelligence. Marcus realized he was probably the first human to have close contact with these creatures. The responsibility was overwhelming. What did they eat? How long before they were old enough to survive on their own? And most importantly, where were their parents? That last question worried him more than anything. If these were babies, their parents were probably looking for them. And if the adult dragons were anything like the legends suggested, they might not take kindly to finding their offspring in the care of a human. Marcus pushed that concern aside for now. The dragons were alive, they were recovering, and that was what mattered. Whatever came next, he would face it when the time came. For now, he had 2 small lives depending on him, and he wouldn't let them down. The larger dragon stretched its tiny wings and made a sound that Marcus could have sworn was a purr. The smaller one crawled closer to its companion and settled down against Marcus's arm, apparently having decided that the human was trustworthy. Marcus smiled as he watched them. He had gone out to repair a sensor array and ended up becoming the caretaker for 2 mythical creatures. It wasn't exactly what he had planned for his day, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to subside, and the first pale rays of Glacialis Prime's sun were breaking through the clouds. The crisis was over. But Marcus had a feeling that his real adventure was just beginning. 3 days after the storm, Marcus had established a routine that revolved entirely around caring for his 2 unexpected guests. He had moved them from the medical bay to his personal quarters, where he could monitor them around the clock. The dragons, whom he had named Frost and Crystal based on their pristine white scales, were recovering better than he had dared hope. The station's other personnel had returned from the emergency bunkers, but Marcus had managed to keep the dragons' presence secret so far. He told his colleagues that he was dealing with some delicate equipment repairs that required his full attention. It wasn't entirely a lie, he reasoned. The dragons were certainly delicate, and they definitely required his full attention. Marcus had converted his small living area into a makeshift nursery. He had requisitioned heating pads, soft blankets, and various supplies under the pretense of equipment maintenance. The dragons seemed comfortable in their new environment, though Marcus was constantly worried about their needs. Feeding them had been his biggest challenge. Dragons weren't exactly covered in any xenobiology textbooks, and Marcus had no idea what they should eat. He started with small pieces of the station's protein rations, soaked in warm water to make them easier to digest. To his relief, both dragons accepted the food eagerly, though Crystal, the smaller one, needed help eating at first. As the days passed, Marcus began to notice just how intelligent his charges were. Frost, the larger dragon, seemed to understand cause and effect relationships. When Marcus brought food, Frost would make specific chirping sounds that were clearly different from other vocalizations. When Marcus was working at his desk, Frost would position himself where he could watch, following the movement of tools and components with obvious interest. Crystal was more timid but equally intelligent. She had learned to recognize the sound of Marcus's footsteps and would become excited when he approached. She also showed remarkable problem-solving abilities, figuring out how to manipulate the heating pad controls with her small claws to adjust the temperature to her liking. Both dragons were growing rapidly. In just 3 days, they had gained noticeable size and weight. Their scales were becoming more lustrous, and their wings were developing greater definition and strength. Frost had even managed brief gliding flights across Marcus's quarters, though his landing technique needed work. It was during one of these flight attempts that Marcus made a discovery that changed everything. Frost had launched himself from the desk toward the bed, but had misjudged the distance. Instead of crashing, however, he seemed to hang in the air for a moment longer than physics should have allowed. Marcus watched in amazement as frost crystals began forming in the air around the young dragon's wings. Frost wasn't just gliding, he was manipulating the air temperature around himself, creating tiny updrafts of condensed air that provided additional lift. It was a biological ability that defied everything Marcus knew about aerodynamics and thermodynamics. Incredible, Marcus whispered, watching as Frost landed gracefully on the bed, seemingly pleased with his successful flight. Crystal, not to be outdone by her companion, demonstrated her own unique ability later that day. Marcus was eating lunch when he noticed that the water in his glass had begun to freeze, forming delicate ice crystals that sparkled in the light. Crystal was sitting nearby, watching him with obvious concentration. When Marcus moved the glass, the ice patterns followed his movements, as if Crystal was controlling the freezing process. Marcus realized he wasn't just caring for ordinary dragons. These creatures had abilities that bordered on the magical. They could manipulate temperature and moisture in ways that seemed to violate physical laws. No wonder the adult dragons had remained hidden from human observation for so long. The implications were staggering. If baby dragons possessed such abilities, what could adult dragons do? Marcus began to understand why no research team had ever managed to get close to the adult creatures. They probably had control over weather patterns, atmospheric conditions, and temperature on a scale that would make them nearly godlike. On the fourth day, Marcus's secret was discovered. Dr. Sarah Williams, the station's chief xenobiologist, came to his quarters to discuss some routine equipment maintenance. Marcus tried to divert her attention, but Crystal chose that moment to make one of her musical chirping sounds from behind the makeshift screen Marcus had set up around their sleeping area. "Marcus, what was that sound?" Dr. Williams asked, her scientific curiosity immediately aroused. Marcus tried to deflect, but it was too late. Crystal, apparently recognizing a new voice, peeked around the screen with obvious interest. Dr. Williams saw the small white head and pale blue eyes, and her face went through a series of expressions that ranged from disbelief to wonder to excitement. "Marcus Chen, is that what I think it is?" she asked in a whisper. Before Marcus could answer, Frost joined Crystal in investigating the newcomer. Both dragons approached Dr. Williams with cautious curiosity, clearly sensing that she represented something different from Marcus. Dr. Williams knelt down slowly, her scientific training warring with her natural excitement. "They're beautiful," she breathed. "Absolutely beautiful. Marcus, do you have any idea what you found here?" Marcus explained how he had discovered the dragons during the storm, his rescue efforts, and everything he had learned about their abilities over the past few days. Dr. Williams listened with growing amazement, occasionally asking questions about their behavior, feeding habits, and physical development. "Marcus, these creatures are incredible beyond anything we ever imagined," Dr. Williams said. "Their ability to manipulate atmospheric conditions could revolutionize our understanding of physics and biology. But more importantly, you've proven that dragons exist on this planet, and you've successfully cared for 2 juveniles without any specialized knowledge or equipment." Marcus felt a surge of pride at her words, but also a growing concern. "Dr. Williams, I need to ask you not to report this to the Research Council yet. I'm worried about what might happen if this becomes public knowledge. These are babies. Their parents are probably looking for them." Dr. Williams nodded thoughtfully. "You're right to be cautious. But Marcus, we need to consider the bigger picture. If adult dragons exist, and they discover that humans have their offspring, the consequences could be severe. We need to develop a plan for returning these babies to their family." As if summoned by their conversation, both dragons suddenly became agitated. They began making sharp, high-pitched calls that Marcus had never heard before. Their scales seemed to shimmer with an inner light, and the temperature in the room began to drop rapidly. "Something's wrong," Marcus said, moving to comfort the dragons. But they were beyond comfort, their distress calls becoming more urgent by the second. The station's proximity alarms began wailing, indicating the approach of large objects in the atmosphere. Marcus and Dr. Williams looked at each other with growing alarm as the implications became clear. "The parents," Dr. Williams whispered. Marcus quickly gathered the two dragons, who clung to him desperately, their small claws gripping his clothing. Their distress calls continued, but now they seemed to be answering something. In the distance, beyond the station's walls, other calls could be heard, deeper, more powerful, and infinitely more threatening. "We need to get to the command center," Dr. Williams said urgently. "The station needs to know what's happening." Marcus nodded, but he was reluctant to leave his quarters. The dragons were terrified, and he felt responsible for their safety. However, the approaching adult dragons represented a threat to the entire station. Everyone needed to understand the situation. They made their way quickly through the station's corridors, the dragons still clinging to Marcus and making their distressed sounds. Other personnel looked at them with confusion and concern, but there was no time for explanations. The command center was in chaos when they arrived. The station's sensors were detecting multiple large objects approaching from the upper atmosphere, moving at speeds that defied conventional aircraft. The objects were too large to be any known spacecraft, and their flight patterns suggested biological rather than mechanical control. Commander Torres, the station's commanding officer, looked up as Marcus and Dr. Williams entered with their unusual cargo. His eyes widened as he saw the dragons, but his military training kept him focused on the immediate crisis. "Dr. Williams, I need to know what we're dealing with," Commander Torres said tersely. "Our sensors are showing at least 3 large objects approaching the station. They're the size of shuttlecraft, but moving like living things." Marcus stepped forward, the dragons still clinging to his chest. "Commander, I believe they're the parents of these 2 juveniles. I found them during the storm, nearly frozen to death. I've been caring for them for the past 4 days." The commander looked at the baby dragons, then at the tactical display showing the approaching objects. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place in his expression. "How intelligent do you think these creatures are?" he asked. Dr. Williams answered before Marcus could speak. "Extremely intelligent, Commander. The juveniles show problem-solving abilities, complex communication, and control over atmospheric conditions that suggests advanced cognitive development. If the adults are proportionally more capable." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the command center understood the implications. They were dealing with creatures that could potentially control weather, had advanced intelligence, and were probably capable of destroying the research station if they perceived humans as a threat to their offspring. The proximity alarms became more urgent as the objects entered the station's immediate airspace. Through the command center's viewports, the staff could see them now. 3 enormous dragons, each the size of a small building, descending from the storm clouds with majestic grace. Their scales gleamed like polished ice, and their wings blocked out large portions of the sky. Marcus felt the baby dragons' distress calls intensify as they sensed their parents' approach. But mixed with the distress, he could hear something else: recognition, joy, hope. "Commander," Marcus said quietly, "I think we need to go outside. The babies want to see their parents, and the adults need to know that their offspring are safe." Commander Torres looked at him as if he had suggested walking into a nuclear reactor. "Marcus, those creatures could freeze this entire station solid or tear it apart with their claws. Going outside is suicide." Marcus looked down at the 2 small dragons in his arms. Frost was looking up at him with those intelligent blue eyes, and Crystal had stopped making distressed sounds, as if she sensed that reunion with her family was near. "Sir, I've spent 4 days earning their trust. If there's any chance of peaceful contact, it has to be through me. These babies are the bridge between our species." The adult dragons had landed now, surrounding the station but not approaching too closely. Through the sensors, the staff could see them clearly. They were magnificent creatures, powerful and graceful, with an obvious intelligence in their movements and positioning. They were waiting. Marcus made his decision. "I'm going out there, Commander. These babies need to be returned to their family, and we need to show that humans can be trusted. As Marcus prepared for what might be the most important first contact in human history, he realized that his simple act of compassion during a storm had changed everything. The relationship between humans and dragons was about to begin, and he would be the one to determine whether it started with trust or tragedy. Marcus stood in the station's airlock, the two baby dragons cradled in his arms, as he prepared to step out and meet three creatures that could easily destroy him with a breath. His environmental suit was powered up and ready, but he knew that if the adult dragons chose to be hostile, no amount of technology would save him. Commander Torres's voice crackled through his comm system. "Marcus, you don't have to do this. We could try to establish communication from inside the station." Marcus looked down at Frost and Crystal, who had become remarkably calm as they sensed their parents' presence. Their pale blue eyes looked up at him with what he could only describe as trust. They believed he would do the right thing. "No, Commander, this has to be personal. These babies have learned to trust humans through direct contact. That's the only way their parents will learn to trust us, too." Dr. Williams's voice joined the conversation. "Marcus, remember everything we discussed about their intelligence. These creatures are at least as smart as we are, possibly smarter. They'll be evaluating not just your actions, but your intentions." Marcus nodded, though no one could see him in the airlock. "I understand. I'm not going out there as a representative of humanity or the research station. I'm going out there as someone who cares about their children." The airlock cycled through its sequence, and Marcus stepped out into the pale sunlight of Glacialis Prime's morning. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a landscape of pristine ice and snow that sparkled like diamonds. The air was still bitterly cold, but the wind had died to a whisper. The three adult dragons were positioned in a triangle around the station, each one approximately 200 meters away. Up close, they were even more magnificent than Marcus had imagined. Their scales were the same pristine white as their offspring, but they seemed to glow with an inner light that made them appear almost ethereal. Their wings were folded against their sides, but even folded, they were enormous. The largest dragon, which Marcus assumed was the father, stood directly in front of the station's main entrance. His head was raised high, and his pale blue eyes were fixed on Marcus with an intensity that was both terrifying and oddly familiar. Those were the same eyes that looked up at Marcus from the babies in his arms, but magnified and filled with the wisdom and power of ages. Marcus walked slowly toward the large dragon, his boots crunching on the snow. With each step, he could feel the weight of history. This was humanity's first direct contact with an intelligent alien species, and it was happening because he had chosen to help two helpless babies during a storm. The baby dragons began to vocalize as they approached their father, making sounds that were similar to their distress calls but warmer and more musical. The adult dragon's head tilted slightly, and he made a deep, resonant sound in response. It was clearly a form of communication, and Marcus could hear the relief and concern in both voices. When Marcus was about 50 meters from the adult dragon, he stopped and slowly knelt in the snow. The symbolic gesture of making himself smaller and less threatening felt important. He held the baby dragons up slightly, making it clear that he was returning them willingly. The large dragon lowered his massive head until it was only a few meters from Marcus. Up close, Marcus could see the incredible detail of the creature's features. The scales weren't simply white, but contained subtle variations of color that created patterns like frost on a window. The eyes were ancient and intelligent, holding depths of knowledge that Marcus could barely comprehend. For a long moment, dragon and human regarded each other in silence. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat in his ears and the soft breathing of the babies in his arms. The adult dragon's breath created small clouds of mist in the cold air. and Marcus noticed that the temperature around them was actually warmer than it should have been. The dragon was controlling the local climate to make the environment more comfortable. Slowly, carefully, Marcus set the baby dragons down in the snow between himself and their father. Frost and Crystal immediately began moving toward the large dragon, making happy chirping sounds as they struggled through the snow on their small legs. The adult dragon's reaction was immediate and touching. His massive head came down to nuzzle the babies gently, making soft, rumbling sounds that were clearly expressions of relief and affection. The two other adult dragons, presumably the mother and perhaps another relative, moved closer to participate in the reunion. Marcus started to back away, thinking his job was done. But the large dragon's attention returned to him immediately. The creature's head rose, and those ancient eyes fixed on Marcus again. This time, however, there was something different in the gaze. Recognition. Gratitude. The dragon spoke. The sound wasn't words in any human language, but somehow Marcus understood the meaning. It was thanks. Deep, profound gratitude from a parent whose children had been returned safely. But it was more than that. It was recognition of the compassion that Marcus had shown, the care he had provided, and the trust he was demonstrating even now. Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes, though they froze almost immediately in the cold air. He nodded to the dragon, hoping to convey that he understood and that the gratitude was mutual. Caring for Frost and Crystal had been a privilege, not a burden. What happened next surprised everyone watching from the station. The large dragon reached out with one massive clawed foot and gently touched Marcus's shoulder. The contact was so carefully controlled that Marcus felt only the slightest pressure, despite the fact that those claws could have crushed him effortlessly. The moment of contact lasted only a few seconds, but Marcus felt something pass between them. Understanding. A connection that transcended species barriers. The dragon was not just thanking him for saving the babies. He was acknowledging Marcus as someone who could be trusted, someone who had proven that not all species were threats to each other. The dragon stepped back and made a series of complex sounds to his companions. The two other adult dragons approached, and Marcus found himself the center of attention for three of the most magnificent creatures he had ever imagined. None of them showed any sign of hostility. Instead, they seemed to be studying him with genuine curiosity and interest. Dr. Williams's voice crackled through his calm. "Marcus, they're scanning you somehow. Our sensors are picking up some kind of energy field emanating from all three dragons. It's like they're learning everything they can about you." Marcus remained perfectly still as the dragons conducted whatever examination they deemed necessary. He could feel a tingling sensation, as if gentle electricity was passing over his skin. It wasn't unpleasant, just unusual. After several minutes, the scanning stopped, and the large dragon made another series of sounds. This time, however, he gestured with his head toward the station. The meaning was clear. He wanted to communicate with the other humans. Commander Torres's voice came through the comm system, directed at both Marcus and the dragon, though Marcus doubted the creature could hear the transmission. "Marcus, ask him if he understands our language." Marcus looked up at the dragon and spoke clearly. "Do you understand what we're saying?" The dragon's response was another series of sounds, but this time Marcus could swear there were human words mixed in with the dragon vocalizations. Broken, heavily accented, but recognizable. "Yes, understand, little." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. These creatures had been observing humanity for long enough to learn at least rudimentary human language. They had been watching the research stations, listening to communications, studying human behavior. The dragons weren't just intelligent, they were actively learning about humanity. "My name is Marcus," he said slowly, pointing to himself. The dragon's head tilted in what might have been a nod. Then, in that same broken but understandable voice, "Marcus, saved, our young, We grateful. Marcus felt his heart racing with excitement. First contact, real, meaningful communication with an alien intelligence. And it was happening because he had chosen compassion over caution during a storm. Over the next hour, with the baby dragons playing in the snow around their parents and Marcus serving as translator and intermediary, a remarkable conversation took place. The dragons, it turned out, had been aware of the human research stations for years. They had been studying humanity from a distance, trying to determine whether humans posed a threat to their species. The dragons were ancient, with lifespans measured in centuries rather than decades. They were the guardians of Glacialis Prime's climate systems, using their abilities to maintain the planet's atmospheric balance. They had hidden from humanity not out of fear, but out of uncertainty about human intentions. Marcus's rescue of the baby dragons had answered their most important question about humanity. When faced with helpless creatures in distress, humans would risk their own safety to provide aid. This was the test that determined whether a species could be trusted, and humanity had passed. The large dragon, whose name translated roughly to Wind Keeper, explained that the babies had been caught in an unprecedented storm that had separated them from their family. They would have died without Marcus's intervention, and the dragon family was eternally grateful. But more importantly, Windkeeper continued. Marcus had demonstrated qualities that the dragon elders valued above all others: compassion without expectation of reward, courage in the face of danger, and the wisdom to act with kindness toward creatures different from himself. As the conversation progressed, it became clear that this was more than just a rescue and reunion. This was the beginning of a relationship between two intelligent species. The dragons were willing to work with humanity, sharing knowledge about the planet's climate systems and atmospheric conditions that could benefit both species. Marcus found himself appointed as the unofficial ambassador between humans and dragons, a role he never could have imagined when he set out to repair a sensor array during a storm. As the day progressed and the formal introductions were made between the dragon family and the research station staff, Marcus reflected on the chain of events that had led to this moment. It had started with a simple choice: to investigate a cry for help rather than focus solely on his assigned task. That choice had led him to discover two helpless creatures who needed his help. His decision to provide that help, despite the personal risk and inconvenience, had earned the trust of an entire species. The dragons now saw humanity as potential allies rather than threats, opening possibilities for cooperation and mutual understanding that could benefit both civilizations for generations to come. Dr. Williams approached Marcus as he watched Frost and Crystal play with their parents in the snow. "Marcus, do you realize what you've accomplished? You've not only made first contact with an intelligent alien species, but you've established the foundation for a peaceful relationship between our peoples." Marcus smiled as he watched Crystal demonstrate her ice crystal abilities to her mother, who responded with obvious pride and encouragement. "I just did what anyone would do, Dr. Williams. I helped someone who needed help." "That's exactly the point," Dr. Williams replied. "You did what any human would do. And that's what makes this so remarkable. Our instinct to help others, even at personal risk, is what convinced them we could be trusted. Your compassion saved 2 lives and changed the course of history." As the sun began to set over Glacialis Prime, painting the ice landscape in shades of gold and purple, Marcus realized that Dr. Williams was right. What made this a truly human moment wasn't his technical skills or his bravery, though both had been necessary. It was his instinctive response to help creatures in need, regardless of their species or origin. The dragons had been testing humanity for years, and Marcus had provided the answer they needed without even knowing he was being tested. Humans could be trusted because, when faced with suffering, their first instinct was to help rather than to exploit. The relationship between humans and dragons would grow and develop over the years to come. There would be cultural exchanges, technological cooperation, and mutual learning that would benefit both species. But it had all started with one simple, very human act. A maintenance technician, hearing a cry for help in a